That's what I want to ask you because the finals are in the beginning of May. Graduation is in a few weeks. You mentioned you know what a Columbia before this looked like. What does a Columbia after this look like? And what is the solution to get to the after of this?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's so challenging to try to come up with a solution as things develop so quickly. But I think what does a Columbia look after this is there must be a way in which we need to repair the immense fractures on our campus. I The divide here is very, very deep, and that's something that's been identified by students, but also by faculty, by administrators themselves. Shafiq, in her own statement, she says that she's deeply saddened. She says that she is really, really trying to grapple with what a divisive community looks like. And so, you know, this is, in a lot of regards, an unprecedented time, absolutely. In some other regards, there is a strange precedent for moments like this, and specifically a very big moment in time for Colombia, cited very heavily and seen in parallel to this moment is 1968, in which there were a lot of anti-war protests at Colombia for against the Vietnam War, and also kind of looped into that was a protest against a gym that was going to be constructed in Morningside Park that had separate entrances for residents and affiliates. It was sort of labeled Jim Crow, a de facto, like what they described as a de facto segregation. So there was, and it was humongous turmoil. And that was one of the only other times in which the university authorized the NYPD to come in and sweep campus, or to clear, in this case, occupied buildings on our campus. And so, yes, this moment is pretty unprecedented. At the same time, when we reflect on 1968 as a larger university community, we we see it as a pain point for our university. We do see it as a stain in our legacy in terms of. I've spoken to, when I did my exit interview with the former president, Lee Bollinger. He sees it as a very big mark on this university that we've been ever since repairing. And that is a really big thing in this, which is to say, is we have learned a lot from that moment and from other moments like it. Um, and I think right now we're in it, in terms of we're in this present, and we're so deeply in the present, and we're so deeply in the day to day. But there has to be a moment to be able to step back and be like, what did we learn from the other times that this has similar things have occurred, right? I can't draw perfect parallels, but the closest thing that I can imagine, again, with the police presence, with the sort of amount of protest, is that moment. And after that moment, there were changes. We established what is called the University Senate. We established these governing bodies and these policies as a checks and balances on the university president, on the administration, to say, hey, the student body needs to have some sort of say in all of this. And so right now we're actually following a development regarding that right now. What potentially the university senate's role, and maybe governing bodies outside of, just the top administration. And when I refer to governing bodies, I mean the university's senate is comprised of students, faculty, and administrators, so kind of like a diverse array. And these are people who are voted in to represent, like, as senators. Um, and so there are conversations about what is the role of, again, something that was established in the aftermath of an incredibly divisive time on our campus that led to the mass arrests of protesters, that led to very, very large scale protests. And we established this thing as a checks and balances. So we need to come back and reevaluate what is the appropriate process moving forward for these so-called checks and balances, right? I think there's been a frustration of, like, well, of course, to some extent, the university can kind of act in the way that it wants to, right? Like, that is the power of the president, and it is an important power in a lot of senses. But when people feel that that has been overstepped, of course, via the NYPD, that is very concerning. And then also, now that these students are kind of on the lawns and with the encampment, there's also a question of, what's their power in all of this? Because I do feel that they have built power in terms of, to be able to disrupt to such an extent, again, very intentionally, is the building of power, and the building of, for the first time maybe, the students have kind of a wedge against the university, where the university is trying to figure out how are they going to proceed. And it's not as simple maybe as they imagined, as okay, we're going to invoke the highest of our powers and have the universe or have the police department come sweep this encampment, because clearly that wasn't enough of a like a incentive to kick students or to propel students to like leave and disrupt or stop this protest. So I think the question moving forward is, what are the checks and balances that are necessary for this situation? Who's going to need to have the power moving forward? Because clearly we're seeing a dynamic shift of the university is in power in a lot of senses, but the students are building power against them in a lot of ways. And that's not just the pro-Palestinian protesters, but there has been a lot of, even with Jewish and Israeli students who have brought up concerns with this, there's clearly building, right? I mean, the congressional hearing is the best example of that power building, right? It's going beyond. So we need to evaluate now who needs to be part of this conversation moving forward in terms of what is the decision to be made, because evidently the university, although it is assumed that it should be operating on its own, or in terms of like the administration, yes, again, does have the sole power to do this, but it seems that they've hit a bar in terms of like they've invoked one of the highest powers that they could possibly invoke against students, and it still hasn't done the results that they need. So what's the step here? Is it continuously invoke that power? Are we going to see another sweep? Are we going to see some fringe sort of outspoken individuals have even implied that we should call in the National Guard? That would, of course, be, I think, a really, really deeply traumatic thing for our university, and also for the public eye and for the image. There's so many implications in that, but I'm bringing that up as a fringe idea that does exist. At the same time, we know that the backlash with that, and also the effectiveness, frankly, of that is kind of in question right now. Is like, at what point does the university expend way too much trying to just repeatedly do what it has done before, invoke the same powers that it has tried to invoke, suspending students, the NYPD, doing all of these like kind of disciplinary like realms, taking sort of some advice from Congress in the sense of like, you need to be cracking down on this, you need to be disciplining the students who are violating your policies, and you need to be explicit about those policies when it comes to anti-Semitism. The university has done that, or it is doing that, and Congress is arguing that they can be doing more. But on the student end, the argument is sort of, where do we go from here if it seems like the students, I truly believe, are very adamant on their demands, and I really don't think it's going so strong in the sense that they're continuing, and I'm actually quite impressed by the level of, for example, like remembering that students are literally sleeping on the lawns, are eating on the lawns, are sharing, are kind of going away with their very comfortable dorm room, their kind of their resources to purposely make a stand. The question from here is, who needs to be involved in that decision, and how do we make it representative enough of the university, right? With consideration that these students can't possibly, although very large in mass, can't possibly represent every single person here. So what's the best way for us to try to do that? Obviously, we can't function in a perfectly democratic way, but if the university has reached a point in which it doesn't seem like there's that much they can do further in terms of like, yes, they can continue suspending students, they could sweep the encampment again, they could do all of this, but what do you do with the movement that stays, right? With this, I would argue, you do that again, the solidarity protests outside become 10 times more intense. The backlash, the outcry from students within become also 10 times more intense. I believe that it could make the campus further unsafe, even with the intention of making it safer by invoking the NYPD, right? These are all conversations that are clearly brewing, and by the fact that, only a few days have passed, but still from Thursday to now, there has been a sort of an interesting lack, or we're trying to understand what the university is quite thinking, because obviously they haven't touched the encampment very much, besides they were like, at first they were saying to not put up tents, now the tents are back up. So we're sort of just watching, right? And interestingly enough, we're spectating.
A word that we keep using in this conversation is flashpoint. The encampment at Columbia spurred national encampments at other universities.
Yeah.
Yesterday, we saw faculty walk out in solidarity with the protesters. Is there any indication of when these conversations towards a resolution will occur?
Right. So, as I mentioned, there are ongoing negotiations between the organizers and administration, although the insight into that is going to be very limited. We're continuing our reporting on that, absolutely. I think, like I said, there has been movement from some of the governing bodies, right? So, the student councils have been kind of in on this, like, sort of surrounding issue for a long time in terms of, like, at least in the periphery, but now they're becoming more and more involved. Just yesterday, the Columbia College Student Council, which represents, of course, the Columbia College undergraduate population, voted, or they proposed a referendum on their ballot, and it was passed with majority. So I believe we're somewhere between 60 to 70% voted in favor of divestment from the university. And also, there were a few other percentages regarding the severance of the program between Tel Aviv University and Columbia, Tel Aviv, the Global Center, and Columbia. So, but of course, that was still, of 40% of the student body voted, and of those 40, 60 to 70% voted in favor, right? We're still talking in numbers that are, but that are building, right? SGA, which is a Barnard version of the councils, also has the same kind of referendum, and a few other councils are contending with the same ballot issue. And, we sort of acknowledged from the beginning that the vote on the ballot doesn't necessarily maybe do anything in terms of tangibly do something, but it shows something is what they're attempting to show. They're attempting to show some sort of attempt at a consensus, or some sort of attempt at something of, like, clearly enough people on this campus believe in a certain way, or that the university should be acting differently. And sort of, I think that's where that is coming in. But there is more movement from, I think, faculty organizers as well, as you pointed out with the walkouts. They have been organizing in the background for a very long time. A lot of what's happening is behind closed doors, and that's why our reporting is super crucial, to try to bring that to light and see what is the insight into all of this. But I truly believe that, that the way forward is going to continuously really have to figure out, who do we need to bring in on this conversation? What's the weight and the level of, like I said, what is the weight we need to give each person's sort of viewpoint and response and thoughts about the university? Because so many people are going to think so many different things, and we can't possibly do all of them at the same time. So we need to come to a way of, as a community, of coming together and imagining, what do we need to move forward, and who do we need to engage? And I think that's the most critical question that it seems that Shafiq is trying to ask, and it seems that her administrators around her are trying to ask, is who needs to be involved in this, whether or not, I think they got to a point where they were able to choose not to engage maybe some of those parties, right, those faculty, those students, but now they're actually being forced to, right, like I said, with the ongoing negotiations with student organizers. So that is what's going to be super critical here, is how is that engagement actually going to tangibly influence what decisions they make moving forward.